It's a disaster that the Trump administration is even in direct talks with the Russians. The EU, which remember is not a military organization, but has begun providing military aid. The story is they're working on a proposal for 20 billion euros in military aid. It doesn't cover all of what America provides, but 20 billion euros is pretty good, right? If they can get it into the right places to make the drones, to get the artillery shells moving, to provide possibly even air power. So, they're going to continue to work on it. Do the Trump people then say, oh, we're going to sanction you for helping Ukraine?
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're talking about the war in Ukraine with Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Scott, welcome.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to you and all your great viewers.
How do you see the progress of US negotiations with Russia and Ukraine?
Oh, the progress is a disaster. I mean, it's a disaster that the Trump administration is even in direct talks with the Russians, who, let us remind ourselves, because the 3-year anniversary is coming up, launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, trying to conquer the country, trying to capture or kill President Zelensky and members of his government. Having failed to conquer all of Ukraine, have continued to attack it on a daily basis, have continued to carry out mass killings on the ground and from the air, are making gradual advances, but are not, quote, winning, but who now are going to be saved by Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is effectively carrying water for Vladimir Putin through direct U.S.-Russia talks, the second set of which he has announced will be next Tuesday in Saudi Arabia, and through he and his allies trashing with lies, with disinformation, with invective, President Zelensky. And beyond that, because you've got to put Ukraine in a wider scope, we are witnessing a U.S. government walk away not only from the security of Ukraine, but from the security of the UK and Europe. And we are witnessing in real time the end of an 84-year alliance, an alliance since 1941 between the U.S. government and its European partners. So Trump folks, of course, will talk about how, this is all progressing nicely because we're talking to the Russians. But I would say if you ask anyone who's interested in the future of Ukraine and its security, they would tell you we should not even be at this point. And had we not had a U.S. government, which is effectively being run as a business and a wannabe autocracy, we would not have been at this point.
So in your view, then, Putin's going to be viewing the Trump administration pretty favorably so far?
Well, okay. Well, let's get to facts, because it's always, that's a pretty broad statement to make. So let's get to facts in terms of where we are. Look, all of us want the Russian invasion to stop. We want the killing to stop. Donald Trump comes in and exploits that by saying the falsehood that there were no wars when he was president, which I won't use the word that my grandfather would use, but I'll say it's absolute rubbish. There were plenty of wars going on when Trump was president, but he comes in and says, I'm the peacemaker, and people would like there to be peace. So his supporters say, oh, he's the man that's going to bring it about. The point here is not going in and having negotiations to end the invasion. That's fine. The question is, on what terms are those talks conducted, and on what terms will the negotiations be resolved? Now, the talks are being conducted by the U.S. and Russia without Ukraine and without European partners who have supported Ukraine. You have already put your thumb on the scales, because that means only 2 participants can set the terms of the negotiations. And the participant who is setting the terms of the negotiations is not the United States. It is Russia. And what are the terms that the Russians are coming in and using? They are saying, we want to be able to hold the Ukrainian territory we have overrun. That's Crimea from back in 2014. That are parts of eastern and southern Ukraine from 2022. And indeed, they're saying you should give us even more territory. Because remember, Vladimir Putin in September 2022 annexed 4 Ukrainian regions, 2 in the south, 2 in the east. Ukraine holds part of those regions, and the Russians are saying, we want them, give them to us. Secondly, the Russians want the lifting of U.S. sanctions. That means if Ukraine does not agree to the terms that are going to be imposed on it, then the economic pressure, which has limited Russia's military capabilities, it will be diminished because the U.S. is important to maintaining the sanctions system. Thirdly, Russia is saying, we want no security guarantees for Ukraine. Okay, it's not just Ukraine doesn't go into NATO, but Ukraine does not get assistance from countries such as members of NATO, including UK, including France and others. They do not get any type of assistance which would be a bulwark against a future Russian attack. Russia sets the terms, and when they do that, they, in effect, have got these maximum demands, and they are getting no pushback from the Americans. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, indicated that the U.S. is willing to consider economic opportunities. And by the way, one of the participants that was there at those talks in Russia was a man named Kirill Dmitriev. Now, why is he important? He's head of Russia's state investment fund, but also he has been negotiating with Trump people since January 2017, when he met a man named Eric Prince, more famous as the founder of the Blackwater mercenaries in the Seychelles. So Dmitriev has been working with the Trump people for years to try to get Russia's objectives. And in this case, we're talking about economic objectives. So the Americans have sort of been willing to look at the economic incentives, let's put it that way. They have been willing to consider the Russian terms to continue to hold on to Ukraine. And remember that Pete Hegseth, on the eve of those talks at the Munich Security Conference, said, we're not going to have Ukraine in NATO. And by the way, we're not actually going to be involved in Ukrainian security. It'll be up to Europe to do that. Oh, and by the way, we're going to distance ourselves from Europe. So they were already handing Russia what it wanted even before those talks started in Riyadh.
And Ukraine have reacted with some level of shock to the events of the last week. What might their next move be, and how they reacted?
Well, again, let's add a couple of layers in terms of what's happening here. I think as the context for this, I think since Trump had become president, indeed since he was elected, Ukraine, President Zelensky, and European leaders, and that includes Keir Starmer, includes Emmanuel Macron, includes Giorgia Meloni, the Italian leader. They all thought, look, if we could flatter Trump, if we could play up to Trump, he won't go all Putin on us. He won't simply go all the way to the Russians on it. And, and at times Trump would make statements like, yeah, we need to get, a decent peace in effect. At times he actually said, oh, yeah, I think I can work with Zelensky. The Munich Security Conference, which took place a week ago, I think that just showed the Europeans and it showed Ukraine it ain't going to happen. It wasn't just Pete Hegseth's speech. An unqualified defense secretary who in effect said, my priority is going to be to purge the U.S. military, by the way, which is happening as we speak. It was also J.D. Vance's speech, just this bitter, horrible, vitriolic speech, completely distorting and manipulating terms like free speech to justify bashing Europe and saying they were unworthy of effectively being partners of the United States unless they turned to far-right parties like Germany's AfD. And I think at that point, a lot of leaders thought, Christ, so we can't flatter Trump. What are we going to do? All right, we can talk a bit later about Emmanuel Macron in Washington on Monday, Keir Starmer there next Thursday. In terms of what Zelensky looked at that point, Zelensky already had a proposal that was on the table from the Americans that was presented to him on February 12th. So that's a week ago, Wednesday. And this is a very important proposal in the context of what is happening, not because it's a very sensible proposal, but because it speaks to what Trump wants. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, brought it across. It was hastily constructed. It was dated February 7th. It wasn't really well thought out through. But what it effectively said is, we want $500 billion of Ukraine's rare earth minerals. Ukraine has large reserves. Now, they haven't been developed yet, but large reserves of lithium, there's manganese, there's titanium. It's trillions of dollars potentially that are there. And not only did Trump effectively say, I want $500 billion, he said, you get nothing in return. because this was in exchange for past American aid, not future American aid. Well, quite understandably, Zelensky looked at it, and he was kind of polite when he rejected it, because he just could have said this is absolute poppycock. But what he said is, it's not ready yet. It's written according to U.S. law, not Ukrainian law, and it gives us inadequate compensation. The story has come out from people at the talks that Scott Bessent put that proposal in front of Zelensky and just said, sign it. Just sign it, right? Zelensky turns it down, and okay, now the ball's back in Trump's court. When that happened, Trump went ballistic on Zelensky on social media. So a lot of what you've heard the headlines that he called Zelensky a dictator, that he said Zelensky has suspended elections in Ukraine, which is terrible. Coming from a guy who tried to overturn elections in the U.S., that's a bit ironic. He said Zelensky has only 4% support. Again, for the record, Zelensky has about 58% support, and more than 60% of Ukrainians continue to support the war effort or the resistance against Russia. And it was because Trump was pissed off as a businessman. They didn't get his way. He's a bully. And when a bully gets pushed back, he shouts a lot. So where we are now is that Keith Kellogg goes to Ukraine later in the week, right? And I hope I'm not going on too long, but all the pieces have to be there. The U.S. talks to Russia on Tuesday. Keith Kellogg is the envoy who is supposed to be there as initially for Ukraine and Russia. He's not at the talks. That's a pretty clear signal. He goes to talk to Zelensky on Thursday, and we're looking at, okay, is he going to put the hammer down on Zelensky? Is he going to trash Zelensky? After their talks, there's a really important signal. Kellogg backs out of the joint press conference. And I'm pretty sure Keith Kellogg didn't make that decision to bail out on that joint press conference. I think he was told not to go through with it. Interestingly, as Donald Trump continues to trash Zelensky on Friday, Zelensky says, I still think we can work with the U.S. I had really good talks with Kellogg. So you can see how Ukraine's still trying to play it in there, right? Kellogg goes on to, things happen on social media now, right? Kellogg goes on social media, says this is an embattled and value, some of the term of praise for Zelensky and his very effective national security team, right? So this is like, oh, holy smoke, there's a Trump official that's praising Zelensky. And of course, within a few hours, Trump goes on Fox Radio, and says, repeats all the falsehoods about Zelensky, not being legitimate, and then says, oh, we're not going to let him into the negotiations. He gave up his chance of being in the negotiations because he's really bad at it. So in effect, what Trump had done with that is he not only trashed Zelensky again, he actually threw Kellogg under the bus. And so where are we today? And again, it is just, you've got to follow this. The Trump people started hammering away and started saying, we're close to a deal. We're close to a deal with Ukraine, right? We're close to a deal. But Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, who is supposed to be one of the adults in the room, he went before the Conservative Political Action Conference, which is an absolute cesspit, and is not helpful to diplomacy at least, and said, effectively, they better sign it. They better sign this, right? Well, guess what happened on Saturday? After 2 days of hearing, Ukraine's going to sign it, Ukraine's going to sign it. Zelensky's people said, we ain't signing. Said, you haven't given us the security guarantees, right? You haven't given us. And, even as I speak to you, the speaker of Ukraine's parliament said, look, we'll begin reviewing this draft on Monday, but we know because people leaked it. The Trump people effectively presented the same draft that they presented back on February 12th. They didn't make any changes and said, sign it now. And Zelensky said, no. And, that's where we are. We're in this bizarre land where you've got US and Russia on this grand bargain. Whereas you're talking about Trump, when it comes to Ukraine, is not talking about their sovereignty, is not talking about their territorial integrity, is not talking about their security. He wants rare earth minerals. I'm going to give you just a point in comparison. Could you imagine in World War II, if Winston Churchill, right, had gone across and said, I'm going to go talk to that Mr. Hitler about Poland. I'll go talk to him about Poland, right? Let's talk about Poland. Maybe talk to him about Norway as well. Maybe I'm going to talk to him about France. And right. And at the meantime, uh, Winston Churchill went across to France and to Norway and to Poland and said, "We'd like your wheat, and we'd like some French wine. Oh, and the Norwegians maybe have herring or something like that, right? We want all your good stuff, and I'm going to talk to Mr. Hitler about effectively allowing him to continue to occupy your countries." That's where we are, and I'm going to emphasize that. I'm going to do it for all the Trump supporters who are going to come back on you on YouTube because I know what these folks are like. If I hear one more explanation from certain UK outlets who I won't name because I'm polite, and certain Trump supporting commentators, including one who was on a couple hours ago trashing Zelensky, who are talking about Trump thinking outside the box. Trump's got a great scheme. So I've heard, for example, that Trump is trying to split Russia from China. There may be Trump advisors who are thinking about that. But Donald Trump has got no clue about splitting Russia from China, right? Donald Trump has no master plan for security. Donald Trump, and I'm going to say it, and you come back on YouTube, folks, and watch if I'm wrong. He wants a meeting with Vladimir Putin because he likes the photo opportunity, and he has always liked the photo opportunities. He would like to, because he's an admirer of Putin, he would like to say up there and say, we have a deal with Putin, in effect, which says that he and Putin are the peacemakers. Remember, Vladimir Putin, the man who tried to conquer Ukraine, equivalent to Adolf Hitler taking Poland. And Trump would like rare earth minerals. That's what he wants. That's where we are.
And Scott, in that case, going forward, where should our eyes be to see how this progresses? As you mentioned, some of the more brash comments have come out from CPAC. That's an event that's never been known for moderation. Or should we be focusing more on Trump's team in Europe? Kellogg or Rubio.
Okay, I'm going to take it from the U.S. and then I want to bring in Europe because that's another key player that we want to talk about here. Okay, when you focus about the U.S., right, after all that things I've talked about, what I want to look at go forward is okay, where are Trump and his advisors going to go next? There is a very, very important article in Politico. I hope you don't mind me name checking another outlet, but in this case, and I really, when an outlet does something, it's important. So what Politico has reported today is that there's a group of hardline Trump advisors, and by hardline, I mean people who are the ones who want to deal with the Russians and who want to cut aid to Ukraine. And they are they are trying to intimidate and isolate those people in the Trump administration who still support Ukraine. Now, the advisors who really want to play up to the Russians include J.D. Vance. Not a big surprise because he has said for years that we shouldn't aid Ukraine. It includes a guy named Stephen Miller, who's better known for U.S. domestic policy, including anti-immigrant policy, but who has Trump's ear, and he is part of this. And it's a camp around Donald Trump Jr. And even though Donald Trump Jr. does not have a position, not quite that much nepotism yet, he's quite influential, and he's very influential in terms of the noise on social. So, for example, just a couple of days ago, he retweeted someone who put up a faked AI video, supposedly showing Zelensky in Ukrainian costume dancing, kind of a crazy comedic dance. It wasn't actually Zelensky, it was just his head on someone's body. But what was important was the line on the top of it. Zelensky is a CIA plant to bring regime change, right? And that's pretty damning. Exactly right. So, you got that really, really nasty camp. And what that camp is trying to do, first of all, is they're targeting Keith Kellogg. That's why I told you the Kellogg story earlier. And Kellogg, I can tell you right now, I think he's got no influence. I think he's got no play here. But what was even more interesting in the Political article is that the two other people I think could have who had been supporters of Ukraine, they had been long-term supporters of Ukraine, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, who I referred to earlier. They said both Rubio and Waltz, there's no way that they're going to come out and call for the support for Ukraine because they think they'll be hit and targeted from within. And one Trump administration official put it out blankly, and he said, look, Marco Rubio He's basically scared to death. He knows that they've lined up a guy named Richard Grenell. Richard Grenell is former U.S. ambassador to Germany in Trump 1.0. He was briefly the head of an intelligence service. He is, and these are from British and European diplomats who have worked with him. He's a handful to work with. Guess who was on the Conservative Political Action Conference stage today, giving out about how we really don't need to be helping Ukraine? Richard Grenell. So Rubio and Waltz have been curbed. They've been put in their boxes. There's no backer from Ukraine that's in there, right? Okay, so what do you have out of all of this? Because Zelensky, all he can do is just try to hold out. This is where the Europeans come in. It's actually where the international community comes in, but I'll start with the Europeans. The Europeans now know that with the end of the alliance in the United States, they're in the position where they may have to go it alone and back Ukraine. But they also know that there's a question of capacity here. Had a really valued colleague, former colleague of mine from the University of Birmingham this week, who just sat me down and walked me through it. He said, look, Germany's got the largest military in Europe right now. They spend about $85 billion a year on their military. The U.S. defense budget, before Trump cuts it, which he's threatening to do, but it's more than $900 billion. Now, that tells you a huge cut. But you can't abandon Ukraine. What I knew was in the works, because I had a very, very, let's say, inside source on this. I knew that members of NATO had been working for 18 months to put up a plan where they were going to put troops into Ukraine, not in the east, but in the west. They were going to put them in the west because they were going to bolster air defenses there. And they were air defenses to protect the energy infrastructure and to protect certain facilities like drone manufacturing plants. Ukraine actually has an advantage in drones now over the Russians, as we've seen on attacks on vital Russian positions. Starmer and Macron effectively allowed that plan to be put out in the media last week, as you know, because the Times covered it, right? Starmer is going to make a play publicly because he's already leaking, which is we're going to increase our defense budget, which is what you want, right? Increase defense budget, 2.5% of GDP. He's probably going to invite Trump state visit, flatter him, yeah. But I suspect Macron first on Monday, and then Starmer are going to pitch this idea to the Americans because they want American air power from Poland and Romania to support this, right? There's your test case. Are there enough adults in the room that you have U.S. support, which are supporting Ukraine like this? But now here's your complication. And I'm sorry for making this really, really long, but there are so many pieces in here. The problem here is if we had a normal, rational administration that was run like a government and not like the Trump organization, then you might be able to get into the U.S. agencies like the intelligence services, state, and defense, and be able to start talking about this plan. But U.S. intelligence services are now led by someone who's pro-Kremlin named Tulsi Gabbard. State Department is facing purges of its personnel, and in facing some very unqualified people who are being named as ambassadors and as medium-ranked staff, and they're now purging the Pentagon with the firing of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the military commanders. So who do you talk to? Who are the adults that you talk to? You can't talk to Keith Kellogg. Waltz and Rubio appear to be boxed in. You can't go to the agencies. So I think Macron and Starmer are going to go across. They're not going to get any traction on this. And then the ball's going to come back to Europe's court, which is, boys, you're going to have to do it, but not do it alone. There's a mistake to do it alone. Remember, there are other countries in here that provide aid to Ukraine. Japan provides aid to Ukraine. A lot of it's non-military, but it's important financial aid. You can talk about the Australians. You can talk about the Canadians. You can talk about certain other Asian countries. And there are international organizations that provide aid to Ukraine, such as the World Bank, such as the International Monetary Fund. So you've got to step up your game to keep those organizations providing the funding which goes through, and just do it for as long as you can to keep holding out and hope that something happens, something breaks in the U.S. system where the Trump head cases finally are kicked to the curb. That's a scenario that relies a lot on domestic politics in the States, and I'll leave it for the moment. But that's where we are.
And as you say, Trump's administration clearly view this as a European problem. They want Europe to solve this problem. But is Trump going to give them that much leeway? I mean, is he going to let Europe lead on Ukraine and let them forge a path away from his own worldview?
Well, here's the thing. If you walk away from Europe, right, you walk away. I mean, the starting point is, well, you ain't got no say in terms of what Europe does. Now, if you're telling me, and this is the bizarre scenario, that Europe then says, look, we're going to provide more assistance to you. And by the way, the EU, which remember is not a military organization, but has begun providing military aid. The story is they're working on a proposal for 20 billion euros in military aid. It doesn't cover all of what America provides, but 20 billion euros is pretty good, right? If they can get it into the right places to make the drones, to get the artillery shells moving, to provide possibly even air power. So, they're going to continue to work on it. Do the Trump people then say, oh, we're going to sanction you for helping Ukraine? I wouldn't rule it out. The guy, Trump, will threaten it, anybody at the drop of a hat with tariffs and with sanctions. But, the fact of the matter is, this just plays to my own long term. I've actually said for more than 25 years, you can't just follow the U.S. This is not new for me. And I actually said it when Bill Clinton was president. So, it's not a Democrat or Republican thing. You're at a point now where you cannot just simply base your policy simply on how you think the Americans are going to react to it. That ship done sailed. And I think what you have to do is that you have to set a marker which is there alongside the U.S.-Russia talks. So, for example, the EU has got its 16th package of sanctions that are about to come into effect. Hungary's threatening to veto it because Viktor Orban is a pal of Putin. He's the leader of Hungary. But you just back the Hungarians down, as has happened in the past. You say, no, we're going ahead with the sanctions. And you just continue to do that. It means the EU has to move a lot faster than the EU is used to moving. And here I've had great debates on this. I think Ursula von der Leyen has been pretty good at the head of the EU. But I will give you the wild card here because I'm speaking to you as Germany is about to go into elections. And you have to hope that you get a German coalition which is going to be supportive of Ukraine. I will actually say I'm more optimistic than others because I think the party that's going to do best is not the hard right AfD, which everybody's going to be headlining. It's actually the Christian Democrats, who will be by far the largest party. They will be the senior partner in the coalition, and I think they'll continue to support Ukraine. In fact, I think they'll give more support to Ukraine than Schultz has.
And there are reports that Ukrainian intelligence is saying that Russia is preparing to actually declare victory in the Donbass. Is there a sign there that Putin is really looking at Trump and the US as his off-ramp from this conflict now?
He's not looking at off-ramp. He's looking to consolidate. The reason why they're going to declare victory is they're going to set a marker down, which is, oh, we declared victory. And then Trump and his people are going to come in and say, oh, well, this is the de facto situation. We've got to recognize it. So let's walk it back to what we're talking about in terms of basics. What Russia wanted was to make all of Ukraine effectively its puppet, right? They were going to put in a guy named Viktor Medvedchuk. He was going to be there at Kyiv. Now, that plan fell apart when they had to withdraw from northern Ukraine in spring of 22. But in September of 22, Putin declares the annexation of those four regions: Luhansk, Donetsk in the east, Zaporizhia, Kherson in the south. But a few weeks later, Ukraine regained a lot of, some of that territory in the south and in the east. Since then, Russia's been trying to claw it back and get territory in the east, but they haven't got all of those four regions. What Putin would like as his optimal is for the U.S. to recognize, for the Trump administration to recognize those four regions as part of Russia, plus Crimea. That's what he would like. Now, I think what he will accept is that the Americans accept the Russian occupation, if not the annexation of it. That's the play that's in here, right? So how do you do that? You declare victory, and Trump gets boxed into saying, well, the Russians have already won and have taken place. What it does is we kick it back to the rest of the world. It is imperative that whether it's European countries, Asian countries, countries in Africa, that no one else recognize that annexation of it. Because here's where I think you look at this in terms of where Ukraine could land. I've said this before Trump won in November, but I'll stick to it because I think this is actually where the Zelensky government is. And that is they're looking for something which is a rough parallel to West Germany, East Germany in the Cold War. That is, all right, the Russians occupy part of our country in the short term. We can't push them out. And Zelensky said we can't push them out. But they want the security guarantees where Putin doesn't grab more territory. And they want the security guarantees where Ukraine can begin to recover. Economic recovery, recovery of its military. Exactly the position that we were talking about in 1948, 1949 when Germany was divided. Now, the Germans had to endure 40 years of division. I don't know if Ukraine will have to endure 40 years of division, but I think if you could show a strong Ukraine with a functioning economy, a functioning government, a military that can defend the country from further Russian aggression, whereas you have an eastern Ukraine, which is badly damaged because, I mean, a lot of it has been leveled, where the people do not have freedom of expression, where the people do not have the social rights they have in Western Ukraine, then that's the line you play it at, and you keep comparing those two areas of Ukraine. I don't think Donald Trump will do that. I think there's no hope of it, but I think that's the counterpoint you put if the U.S. and Russia try to impose a settlement on you.
Scott Lucas, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you all very much.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.